Emma sat in her spotless kitchen, the soft hum of the dishwasher the only sound breaking the silence. The early morning sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting a golden glow on the marble countertops. She stared at her untouched cup of coffee, her thoughts swirling. The life she had built with her husband, John, looked perfect on the outside. A beautiful home in Chicago, 2 flourishing careers, and their son, Alex, successfully navigating college. But the cracks beneath the surface were growing wider, threatening to shatter the illusion. 15 years of marriage had once seemed like a triumph. Emma, a cardiologist with a demanding schedule, had always found solace in John's steady presence. A history professor at a prestigious university, he exuded an air of confidence and reliability that had drawn her to him in the first place. They had built a life together, piece by piece, through late-night study sessions during grad school, years of parenting, and shared dreams of growing old together. But lately, that life felt more like a shared facade than a partnership. The signs had started small: a distracted look during dinner, an increase in late nights at the university, and a reluctance to engage in the playful banter that had once defined their relationship. Emma had brushed it off as stress, telling herself that they were both simply busy. But then came the text message she hadn't meant to see. It had been an ordinary morning, and John had left his phone on the counter while grabbing his bag for work. A notification popped up, catching Emma's eye. She wasn't the type to snoop, but the message was impossible to ignore. "Thanks for last night. Can't stop thinking about our conversation. Natalie." Her heart had skipped a beat. Natalie was one of John's students, a bright-eyed undergrad who had attended a recent dinner party they hosted. Emma had thought nothing of her then, chalking up her lingering gaze at John to a harmless student crush. But now, that single message gnawed at her. Emma hadn't confronted John. The thought of asking him outright made her stomach churn. What if he denied it? Worse, what if he didn't? Instead, she had spent the past week analyzing every interaction with him, dissecting every word and gesture for hidden meaning. She hadn't found any concrete answers, only a growing sense of dread. She glanced at the clock. John would be coming downstairs any moment, briefcase in hand, ready to tackle another day of teaching. Sure enough, moments later, she heard his familiar footsteps on the stairs. When he appeared, dressed sharply in his usual blazer and tie, she couldn't help but study him with fresh eyes. "Morning," he said, his voice pleasant but detached as he poured himself a cup of coffee. "Morning," Emma replied, forcing a smile. "Busy day ahead?" "As always." He leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone. "Office hours, a faculty meeting, and probably some grading. I'll be home late." Emma's chest tightened. The words were routine, but her mind twisted them into something sinister. What if late means he's seeing her? She hated the thought, hated herself for even considering it, but she couldn't shake it. "Anything exciting happening at work?" she asked, keeping her tone light. John shrugged, glancing at his watch. "Nothing out of the ordinary." He kissed her cheek, a perfunctory gesture that felt more like an obligation than an expression of love. "Don't wait up." As he walked out the door, Emma stood frozen, staring at the empty space he left behind. The silence of the house felt heavier than ever. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up to see a text from Alex. "Staying on campus for dinner tonight. Don't worry about me." Emma sighed. Her son, once so close and open with her, had been pulling away since starting college. It was natural, she told herself, but it added to her growing sense of isolation. She had hoped for a quiet dinner together, some semblance of normalcy, but even that seemed out of reach. As the day dragged on, Emma found herself increasingly consumed by her suspicions. After finishing her last patient consultation, she sat in her office and opened her laptop, typing signs of infidelity into the search bar. Article after article offered advice on what to look for, how to catch a cheating spouse, and, most disturbingly, how to test their loyalty. One suggestion caught her attention: hire someone to test your partner's fidelity. The idea seemed absurd, even cruel, but the longer she stared at the screen, the more the idea took root. If John is innocent, there's no harm done, she reasoned. But if he isn't? She couldn't even finish the thought. That evening, She sat in the living room with her laptop, staring at a sleek website advertising discreet and professional services. The testimonials were glowing, praising the company's tact and efficiency. Emma hesitated, her finger hovering over the Contact Us button. Her mind raced with doubts. Was she about to make the biggest mistake of her life? Or was this the only way to uncover the truth? With a deep breath, she clicked the button and began typing her message. As the email was sent, a strange mix of relief and dread washed over her. The first step had been taken, and there was no turning back now. Little did she know, the truth she sought would be far more complicated and devastating than she could imagine. Emma sat in her car in the hospital parking garage, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her chest felt heavy with doubt, fear, and a whisper of hope. Hope that she was wrong about John, that this was all some colossal misunderstanding. But the nagging suspicion wouldn't leave her. The email she had sent the night before had received a prompt reply. The agency, one that specialized in discreet investigations, had arranged a meeting for her with one of their top operatives, a woman named Grace. Emma stared at her phone, rereading the confirmation message for the 100th time. "We look forward to assisting you. Please meet Grace tomorrow at noon. Café Bellevue, downtown Chicago." She had debated canceling the meeting all morning. A part of her felt ridiculous, paranoid, even. But then she would remember the text from Natalie, the late nights, the growing distance between her and John, and her resolve would harden. She had to know the truth. The cafe was trendy yet intimate, its muted tones and dim lighting creating a sense of privacy despite the buzz of conversation. Emma arrived early, her nerves making her fidget with her coat as she scanned the room. Her eyes landed on a striking woman sitting by the window, a small notebook open in front of her. Grace. She was younger than Emma expected, likely in her early 30s, with sleek dark hair that framed a sharp, elegant face. Her tailored blazer and calm demeanor radiated confidence. Emma hesitated, her heart pounding as she crossed the room. "Grace?" she asked softly. The woman looked up, her hazel eyes warm but piercing. "Emma, please sit." Her voice was smooth and steady, the kind that could command attention without raising an octave. Emma sat, clutching her handbag tightly. For a moment, she felt foolish. What was she doing here, enlisting the help of a stranger to test her husband's loyalty? But Grace didn't seem fazed. She closed her notebook and folded her hands neatly on the table, her full attention on Emma. "So," Grace began, her tone professional yet gentle. "Tell me what's going on." Emma swallowed hard, her voice shaky. "I think my husband might be cheating on me. I don't have proof, just signs. A text I saw, the way he's been acting, his late nights. It could all be innocent, but she broke off, biting her lip. Grace nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You want certainty." "Yes," Emma said, her voice firmer now. "If I confront him without proof and I'm wrong, I'll destroy what little trust we have left. But if I'm right..." Her words trailed off as a lump formed in her throat. Grace leaned back, studying her. "It's not an easy decision to make, Emma, but I understand why you're here. You're looking for clarity, and I can help you get it. Just know that this process can be uncomfortable." Emma's stomach churned at the implication. "What exactly will you do?" Grace's lips curved into a faint smile. "I'll start with a casual encounter. Something low-key. If your husband isn't inclined, it'll end there. But if he is..." She let the sentence hang in the air. Emma looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring nervously. "I don't want you to cross any lines. I just need to know if he would. If he could..." Grace nodded. "I'll respect your boundaries. My role is to test, not to tempt beyond what's already there." The weight of the decision pressed down on Emma as she reached into her bag and pulled out a photo of John. It was a candid shot, taken on a rare family trip to the lake 2 years ago. John stood with Alex by the water, both smiling at the camera. She slid the photo across the table, her heart aching as she did. "This is him," Emma said quietly. "His name is John. He's a history professor at the University of Chicago." Grace studied the photo for a moment before tucking it into her notebook. "What's his schedule like?" Emma hesitated, then rattled off the details. "His office hours, the cafe where he sometimes worked, his usual routine. Each word felt like a betrayal, but she couldn't stop herself. Grace listened intently, then leaned forward, her tone softening. "You're sure you want to do this?" Emma met her gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think I have a choice." That night, Emma sat alone in the living room, her laptop balanced on her knees. She tried to focus on the medical journal she'd been meaning to catch up on, but the words blurred together. Her mind was consumed by the what-ifs. What if John passed Grace's test? Could she ever forgive herself for doubting him? And what if he failed? The sound of the front door opening startled her. John walked in, looking as composed as ever, his briefcase slung over his shoulder. "Long day?" Emma asked, trying to keep her voice casual. John nodded, loosening his tie. "Exhausting. I'm heading to bed." As he disappeared upstairs, Emma's chest tightened. He seemed so normal, so unaffected. Was she imagining things? Or was he simply a better liar than she realized? The following afternoon, Grace texted Emma, "I've made contact." He was polite but guarded. "I'll keep you updated." Emma stared at the message, her emotions in turmoil. Relief that nothing had happened yet, dread at what might come next. She replied with a simple thank you, but her hands trembled as she typed. She had taken the first step down a dark path, and with every passing moment, the weight of her decision grew heavier. She wanted to believe this was all in her head, that John was still the man she had married. But deep down, she feared the truth would be far worse than she imagined. And she wasn't wrong. The truth was coming, just not in the way she expected. Grace adjusted her scarf as she leaned against a brick wall outside the University of Chicago's lecture hall. She glanced at her watch, then around the bustling campus. Students hurried by, clutching books and steaming coffee cups, their voices rising in a chaotic symphony of ambition and youth. Grace, as always, blended effortlessly into the scene, unassuming yet unmistakably poised. John's photo was tucked neatly into her notebook. She had memorized his face, his demeanor, the little details Emma had shared about him. Now she just needed to make the first move. The lecture hall doors swung open, and a stream of students poured out. Grace's sharp eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on him. John exited with a briefcase slung over his shoulder, his gait calm, his attention momentarily on the papers he was slipping inside the bag. Grace's lips curved into a faint smile. Timing was everything. As John walked past her, she deliberately let her scarf slip from her hand. It fluttered to the ground, and she bent to pick it up just as he approached. "Excuse me," she said lightly, brushing her hair back as she straightened. John stopped, glancing at her. "Oh, no problem." Grace smiled warmly, holding the scarf in one hand. "Thanks. I'm usually not this clumsy." John chuckled softly. "It happens to the best of us." Grace extended her hand. "Grace." John hesitated briefly before shaking her hand. "John." The connection was fleeting but deliberate. Grace noticed the way his gaze lingered for just a moment longer than necessary. It was subtle, a flicker of curiosity he quickly masked. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Grace said, tilting her head slightly. "You looked like you were on your way to something important." "Office hours," John replied, glancing at his watch. "But I'm not late." "Yet." Grace let out a soft laugh. "Busy life, huh?" John shrugged. "I suppose." Grace stepped back, giving him space. "Well, I won't keep you. But if you ever need a good spot for coffee, there's a great little place a few blocks over. Bellevue Cafe. Best lattes in the city." John raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth twitching in a faint smile. "I'll keep that in mind." As he walked away, Grace noted the slight hesitation in his step. He glanced back once, just for a second, before continuing on. It wasn't much, but it was enough. That evening, Grace sat in a quiet corner of Bellevue Cafe, her phone resting on the table. Emma arrived, her expression tense as she slipped into the seat across from her. "How did it go?" Emma asked, her voice tight with anticipation. Grace took a moment to arrange her thoughts, sipping her coffee before replying. "We met. It was brief, just a casual introduction." He was polite but guarded. Emma's shoulders sagged slightly, relief flickering in her eyes. "So, Nothing happened? Not yet, Grace said carefully. But he noticed me. That's the first step. Emma gripped her coffee cup, her fingers trembling slightly. Do you think he's interested? Grace tilted her head, studying Emma. He's curious. But I'll need to interact with him again to get a clearer picture. Emma's gaze dropped to the table. I don't know if I can handle this, she admitted. It feels wrong, like I'm betraying him. Grace leaned forward, her tone gentle but firm. You're not betraying him, Emma. You're seeking the truth. Whatever happens, it's better than living with doubt. Emma nodded, though her expression remained conflicted. I just want to know where we stand. If he's cheating, I need to know. Grace reached across the table, her fingers brushing Emma's hand briefly. We'll find out. Together. 2 days later, Grace returned to campus. This time, she found John seated on a bench in the courtyard, a stack of papers on his lap. His brow furrowed as he marked notes in red pen, his focus unwavering. Grace approached with a coffee cup in hand, her steps measured and deliberate. John, right? She said, her tone warm and familiar. John looked up, surprise flashing across his face. Grace, thought I'd repay the favor, she said, holding out the coffee. You looked like you could use this. John hesitated before taking the cup. Thanks. That's thoughtful of you. Grace sat beside him, her body angled slightly toward him. Grading papers, I see. Must be exhausting. He chuckled softly. You get used to it. Still, Grace said, brushing a stray hair from her face, you deserve a break. Life's too short to spend it buried under a mountain of work. John glanced at her, his expression softening. You're not wrong. Their conversation drifted to lighter topics, books, travel, the quirks of university life. Grace kept her tone easy, her laughter genuine, but her observations sharp. She noted the way John's shoulders relaxed, the way his smile lingered just a bit longer than it had the day before. As she stood to leave, she adjusted her scarf, letting it fall against her shoulder. Maybe next time, I'll let you buy me a coffee instead, she said with a playful smile. John blinked, caught off guard. Sure. That sounds nice. Grace walked away, her steps confident, her heart racing. John's polite exterior was intact, but there was something beneath it, a spark she intended to fan. That night, Emma received a text from Grace. We spoke again. He's intrigued, but not convinced. Let's see how far he'll go. Emma stared at the message for a long time, her heart pounding. She typed a reply and deleted it twice before finally sending. Keep going. I need to know. Grace smiled faintly as she read Emma's response. The game had only just begun, and she was already relishing the chase. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the chase was leading her somewhere far darker than she had ever anticipated. Emma sat in her kitchen, sipping her morning coffee as sunlight streamed through the windows. She was attempting to maintain her routine, but the knot of tension in her stomach had become her constant companion. Grace's updates about John had been measured but unsettling. The idea of her husband being intrigued by another woman gnawed at her, even as she clung to the hope that he hadn't crossed any definitive lines. Not yet. Her phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the silence. She reached for it, expecting another text from Grace, but it was Alex. Home for dinner tonight. Got something to talk about. Emma frowned. Alex rarely announced his plans with such precision, and his tone seemed unusual, direct, almost curt. She quickly typed back. Of course. Looking forward to it. She set the phone down and stared at her reflection in the darkened screen. Whatever Alex wanted to discuss, she hoped it would distract her from the whirlwind of emotions she had been suppressing. That evening, Alex arrived promptly, dropping his bag by the door and brushing the cold Chicago air off his jacket. Emma greeted him with a smile, her heart lifting at the sight of her son. He was tall, with John's sharp features and her expressive eyes. Hey, Mom, he said, leaning down to kiss her cheek. Hey, sweetie. Hungry? I made lasagna. Starving, Alex replied, following her into the dining room. They ate quietly at first, exchanging pleasantries about his classes and her work. But Emma could tell something was weighing on him. Alex kept glancing at her, his brow furrowed, as though searching for the right words. Finally, as they cleared the table, he broke the silence. "Mom, I need to ask you something," he began, his tone serious. Emma's heart skipped a beat. "Of course. What is it?" He hesitated, then reached into his backpack and pulled out a photo, one Emma recognized immediately. It was the picture of John she had given to Grace. "Why do you have this?" Alex asked, his voice tight. Emma's stomach dropped. "Where did you find that?" "In your office," Alex said, his eyes narrowing. "I wasn't snooping. I just saw it when I dropped off your mail the other day." And then, he trailed off, shaking his head. Emma swallowed hard, her mind racing. She hadn't expected Alex to stumble across something so incriminating. "Alex, I can't explain," she began, her voice trembling. "Explain what?" he demanded, his tone sharp. "Why you're spying on Dad. Why you're giving his picture to—" He paused, glancing away as if unsure he wanted to say the next words. "That woman?" Emma froze. "What woman?" Alex hesitated, then met her gaze. "I've seen her, Mom, at Dad's campus. A few days ago. She was with him." Emma's breath caught. "You saw Grace? That's her name?" Alex said, his jaw tightening. "She was sitting with Dad on a bench, talking like they were old friends." "Who is she? And why does she have Dad's picture?" Emma's head spun as she tried to process Alex's revelation. Grace had mentioned speaking with John again, but she hadn't mentioned that Alex might have seen them. How could she explain this to her son without unraveling the delicate threads of her plan? "She's an investigator," Emma admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex's brow furrowed in confusion. "An investigator? For what?" Emma took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she set the dishes aside. "I hired her to test your father's loyalty. I didn't know how else to handle things, Alex. I thought he might be cheating on me." The room fell into a heavy silence. Alex stared at her, his expression a mix of disbelief and anger. "You hired someone to seduce Dad?" "No," Emma said quickly. "Not to seduce him. Just to see if he would ever—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Alex shook his head, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Mom, do you even hear yourself? You're trying to trap him, and for what? A suspicion? A gut feeling?" "It's more than that," Emma said, her voice breaking. "There's been distance between us for months. He's been lying, Alex. I saw a text message from one of his students, Natalie. It was inappropriate." Alex's expression darkened at the mention of Natalie, but he said nothing. Emma pressed on, her voice desperate. "I didn't want to believe it, but I needed to know. I couldn't confront him without proof. And now, I don't know what to think." Alex rubbed his temples, pacing the length of the room. "You don't think this could make everything worse? What if Dad finds out? What if—" He stopped abruptly, his eyes widening slightly. "What is it?" Emma asked, stepping closer. Alex hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing. I need to think." Before Emma could respond, Alex grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. "I'll call you later," he said, his tone distant. "Alex," she called after him, but the door had already closed. Later that night, Emma sat alone in the dimly lit living room, her thoughts racing. Alex's reaction had shaken her more than she cared to admit. His anger, his disbelief, it was all justified. But there had been something else in his eyes. Fear? Guilt? She couldn't place it, but it left a sinking feeling in her chest. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she reached for it, expecting another update from Grace. Instead, it was a message from Alex. "You need to be careful, Mom. There's more going on than you realize." Emma stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. What did Alex know? And why wasn't he telling her? For the first time, Emma felt the fragile control she had over the situation slipping through her fingers. And she had the unsettling sense that her son might be hiding a truth even more dangerous than the one she was seeking. Grace adjusted her blazer as she stepped into the dimly lit wine bar just a few blocks from the university. The space hummed with quiet conversations and the soft clink of glasses. She scanned the room, her sharp gaze settling on John seated at a corner table, his head bent over a menu. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes more pronounced than she remembered. Yet there was still a certain charm about him, the quiet confidence of a man used to commanding respect. Grace allowed herself a moment to study him. Every gesture, every subtle movement, was a clue to the man beneath the polished exterior. Tonight wasn't just about testing his boundaries. It was about peeling back the layers of his restraint, one by one. She approached the table, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. "John," she said warmly, a faint smile playing on her lips. "This must be fate. I didn't expect to see you here." John looked up, surprise flickering across his face before he returned her smile. "Grace, this is unexpected." "I was just meeting a colleague," Grace said smoothly, sliding into the seat across from him without waiting for an invitation. "They canceled last minute, but I figured I'd enjoy the wine anyway. And now, I get to enjoy your company too." John chuckled, closing the menu. "Well, I can't promise to be as engaging as your colleague, but I'll do my best." Grace leaned forward slightly, her elbows resting on the table, her body language open and inviting. "You seem like someone who's naturally engaging. I bet your students love you." John shook his head, a self-deprecating smile on his lips. "I think they tolerate me, mostly." "I doubt that," Grace countered, her tone playful. "You have a way about you. Charisma, I think they call it." John hesitated, his smile faltering just slightly. Grace caught the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the kind of moment that made her job both thrilling and dangerous. He was intrigued, but the weight of something, guilt, doubt, perhaps loyalty, held him back. "What brings you here tonight?" John asked, steering the conversation away from himself. Grace tilted her head, letting her hair fall softly over one shoulder. "Sometimes, I like to escape the chaos of the day. This place has a calming effect, don't you think?" John nodded, his expression softening. "It does. Life gets overwhelming sometimes." Grace studied him carefully, noting the way his shoulders slumped slightly, the faint weariness in his voice. "I get the sense you carry a lot on your shoulders, John," she said gently. "More than most people realize." He looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "What makes you say that?" "It's in the way you hold yourself," Grace replied, her voice low and empathetic. "Like someone who's always solving problems, always keeping things together." "But who's keeping things together for you?" John blinked, clearly taken aback by the question. He opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, his gaze dropping to his hands. Grace let the silence linger, knowing that sometimes the weight of unspoken words was more powerful than anything she could say. Finally, he sighed. "I guess I don't really think about it." Grace reached across the table, letting her fingers brush lightly against the back of his hand. "Maybe you should." John stiffened slightly at the touch, but didn't pull away. The air between them grew heavy, charged with unspoken possibilities. Grace felt the tension in his restraint, the battle waging within him, and she leaned into it. "You deserve to have someone who sees you, John," she said softly. "Someone who really understands what you need." For a moment, she thought he might lean closer, might let the defenses he'd so carefully constructed come crashing down. But then he straightened, his expression hardening. "Grace," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm married." "I know," Grace replied, her tone unwavering. "And I respect that. But wanting connection doesn't make you a bad person." John's jaw tightened, and he glanced away, clearly searching for an escape. Grace withdrew her hand, leaning back with a small, apologetic smile. "I'm sorry if I overstepped. Sometimes I just speak my mind too freely." John shook his head, his tone softening. "It's not that. It's just complicated." "I understand," Grace said, her voice gentle. "But if you ever need someone to talk to, someone who won't judge or expect anything in return, I'm here." John nodded slowly, his guard still up but visibly shaken. Grace could see it in his eyes, the temptation he was trying so hard to suppress. She didn't need him to act tonight. She just needed to plant the seed. That night, Grace sat on the edge of her bed, typing a message to Emma. "We had drinks. He's opening up, but he's still holding back. I'll keep pushing." Emma's reply came almost instantly. Do what you need to. I need to know the truth. Grace exhaled, setting her phone aside. She knew she was close to a breakthrough. But for the first time, a flicker of doubt crept into her mind. It wasn't about John. It was about Emma. The desperation in her texts, the weight of her silence. Grace couldn't help but wonder if Emma was truly prepared for what she might discover. Meanwhile, John sat alone in his study, staring at a stack of ungraded papers. His thoughts were a tangled mess, and no matter how hard he tried to focus, they kept drifting back to Grace. Her words, her touch, the way she seemed to see right through him. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the dim light. He told himself he had done nothing wrong, that he had drawn the line where it mattered. But the truth gnawed at him. He had wanted to cross it. As he sipped the whiskey, a text notification lit up his phone. It was from Natalie. Looking forward to our meeting tomorrow. Let me know if there's anything you need me to prepare. John stared at the message, his chest tightening. He knew Natalie's intentions weren't purely professional, and for the first time, he wondered if his resolve was strong enough to resist temptation from more than one direction. In another part of the city, Alex lay awake in his dorm room, his phone clutched in his hand. He scrolled through old messages, his jaw clenched. He knew more than he had let on to his mother, and what he knew could destroy everything. But for now, he wasn't ready to reveal the full truth. Not yet. The rain drummed steadily against the windows of Emma's house as she paced the kitchen, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Grace's updates had been sparse since their last conversation, but the few messages she had received only deepened Emma's unease. John was wavering. He hadn't crossed the line yet, but it was clear that he was tempted. The house felt too quiet. John was still at the university, and Alex hadn't responded to her texts since storming out days ago. Emma tried to push the memory of their confrontation to the back of her mind, but his anger, the way he looked at her like she'd betrayed him, replayed in her thoughts on a loop. Her phone buzzed suddenly, pulling her out of her reverie. A message from Alex. I'm coming over tonight. I need to tell you something. Emma's heart leapt into her throat. She quickly typed back. I'll be here. Just let me know when you're on your way. She set the phone down, her palms sweaty. What did he need to say? Was it about John? Grace? Or something else entirely? Alex arrived just as the rain tapered off, his jacket soaked and his face pale under the porch light. Emma opened the door before he could knock, her worry immediately doubling as she took in his tense posture. Come in, she said softly, stepping aside. Alex shrugged off his jacket, shaking off the water, and followed her into the kitchen. He didn't sit, instead pacing the room as Emma hovered near the counter. Tea? Coffee? She offered, desperate to break the silence. No, I'm fine, Alex said quickly, waving her off. He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his jaw tight. I should have told you this sooner, but I didn't know how. Emma's stomach churned. Alex, what's going on? You're scaring me. He hesitated, running a hand through his damp hair. It's about Natalie, he said finally. Emma blinked, confused. Natalie? John's student? Alex nodded, his expression hardening. Yeah, she's not just Dad's student. She's been seeing me. The words hit Emma like a punch to the gut. What? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Alex sighed, his shoulders slumping. It started a few months ago. She approached me at a party on campus. At first, I thought she was just being friendly. But then, things escalated. We started texting, meeting up. I didn't think much of it until she started asking questions about Dad. Emma's mind raced, her thoughts a tangled mess. Questions about John? Why? Alex grimaced. She was fishing for something, anything she could use to get close to him. She told me she admired him, but it was more than that. She was obsessed. I didn't realize it at first, but looking back, she used me. She got close to me to get to him. Emma gripped the counter for support, her head spinning. Alex, why didn't you tell me this sooner? I didn't think it mattered, he said, his voice rising with frustration. I thought she was just some student with a crush. But then I saw the way she acted around him, the way she looked at him, the texts she sent. She told me they were working on something academic, but I knew it was more than that. Emma's hands trembled as she pieced together the implications. Does John know about you and Natalie? Alex shook his head. No. She told me to keep it quiet. Said it would ruin everything. But now I think she's been using both of us. And when I saw that woman, Grace, with Dad on campus, I thought maybe she was part of it too. Emma's breath caught. Grace isn't part of this, she said quickly. She's helping me. Alex frowned, his confusion deepening. Helping you how? Emma hesitated, the weight of her secret suddenly feeling unbearable. I hired Grace to test your father, to see if he'd betray me. Alex's eyes widened in disbelief. You hired someone to, Mom. What the hell? I had to know, Emma said, her voice cracking. After everything I've seen, everything I've felt, I had to know if he was lying to me. Alex turned away, running a hand through his hair again. This whole thing is insane, he muttered. Dad, Natalie, Grace. None of it makes sense. Emma stepped closer, her voice softer now. Alex, why are you telling me this now? Did something happen? Alex's shoulders stiffened. Natalie called me this morning. She said she was meeting Dad tonight. She sounded excited. Emma's blood ran cold. Did she say where? No, Alex said, his voice grim. But I think it's serious. Whatever she's planning, she's not just going to let this go. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. Alex stayed for dinner, but neither of them ate much. They sat in silence, the weight of their shared knowledge pressing down on them like a storm cloud. When John walked through the door later that night, Emma's stomach tightened. He seemed relaxed, his briefcase slung over one shoulder, his jacket damp from the rain. He greeted Alex with a nod and Emma with a quick kiss on the cheek, as though nothing was amiss. Long day? Emma asked, her voice carefully neutral. Exhausting, John replied, setting his things down. I'm heading to bed. As he disappeared upstairs, Alex looked at Emma, his jaw set. You need to talk to him before this blows up. Emma nodded, her chest tightening with dread. I will. But first, I need to know exactly what Natalie is planning. That night, Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling as rain began to fall again outside. Alex's confession had opened a new layer to the tangled web she was caught in, one she hadn't even considered. Natalie wasn't just some flirtatious student. She was a threat, one who had already infiltrated her family in ways Emma could barely comprehend. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from Grace. I think something's happening. We need to meet. Emma's heart raced as she read the words. Whatever was about to unfold, she knew it was bigger than just her and John, and the next step could shatter everything. The morning broke gray and heavy, the Chicago skyline barely visible through the misting rain. Emma drove through the city in silence, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. Grace's text the night before had rattled her, and the cryptic nature of their meeting only deepened her unease. The cafe was nearly empty when Emma arrived. Grace was already there, seated in a corner booth, her expression unreadable. She wore a tailored blazer, her dark hair pulled back into a sleek ponytail, radiating her usual composure. But Emma noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers tapped against her coffee cup. Emma slid into the seat across from her, pulling off her coat. What's going on? She asked, her voice tight. You said something was happening. Grace leaned forward, her hazel eyes sharp. John knows about me. The words hit Emma like a freight train. What? She whispered, her heart pounding. He knows Emma, Grace repeated. And he's known for a while. Emma's head spun. How? You've been careful. Grace held up a hand, cutting her off. It wasn't me. He found out through Alex. Emma froze. Alex? Grace nodded, her jaw tightening. Your son overheard you talking about me. He didn't understand the full context, but he pieced together enough to figure out I wasn't just some random woman. He told John about it. Emma felt the air leave her lungs. But Alex didn't. He wouldn't have. Grace's gaze softened, but her tone remained firm. He didn't mean to sabotage you. But John's not stupid. Once he had a hint of what was going on, he started testing me. He played along just enough to keep me close, but I could feel it. He was always one step ahead. Emma buried her face in her hands, her thoughts a chaotic swirl. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I wasn't sure until last night, Grace admitted. But when we met at the bar, he said something that confirmed it. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "How's Emma handling all of this?" Emma's stomach twisted. He knew. He knew, Grace echoed. And he's been using it to his advantage. He wants to control the narrative, Emma. To make you doubt yourself. Emma's hands trembled as she reached for her coffee, taking a shaky sip. What do I do now? How do I confront him? Grace hesitated, then leaned closer. There's more. Emma's pulse quickened. What? Natalie, Grace said, her voice dropping lower. She's involved in this, too. Emma's eyes widened. How? Grace glanced around the cafe, ensuring no one was within earshot. I think she's playing a long game. She approached me last night, casually, at first. But then she started asking questions about you, about John. It was clear she knows more than she should. She's manipulating Alex, Emma said, her voice shaking. She's been using him to get closer to John. He told me as much. Grace's jaw clenched. She's not just some infatuated student, Emma. She's calculating. And I think she's hoping to exploit the tension in your family to her advantage. Emma sat back, her mind racing. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but the picture they painted was more sinister than she could have imagined. What do you suggest? Emma asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Grace's eyes met hers, steady and resolute. We need to confront both of them, John and Natalie. Separately. You need to show John that you know exactly what he's been doing, and Natalie needs to understand that she's not going to get away with this. Emma swallowed hard. And Alex? He's already so tangled up in this. We protect him, Grace said firmly. But he needs to be honest with you, too. He's been hiding things, Emma. If we're going to fix this, we need all the pieces on the table. That evening, Emma sat in the living room, waiting for John to come home. The tension in the air was suffocating, the weight of the impending confrontation pressing down on her like a storm cloud. When the front door opened, her breath caught. John walked in, his usual calm demeanor intact, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Wariness, maybe even guilt. Emma, he said, setting his briefcase down. What's going on? We need to talk, Emma said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. John hesitated, then nodded, sitting across from her. All right, I'm listening. Emma leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. I know about Natalie, and I know about Grace. John's expression didn't change, but she saw the slight twitch in his jaw. What exactly do you think you know? I know you've been lying to me, Emma said, her voice rising. About the late nights, the distance, the way you've been playing this game with Grace like it's some kind of sport. And Natalie, she's been manipulating Alex to get to you. Did you know that? John leaned back, his arms crossed. This is ridiculous. Is it? Emma snapped. Because I have proof, John. I have everything I need to show just how far this has gone. John's eyes narrowed. And what exactly do you plan to do with that proof? Tear apart our family? Embarrass me at work? Emma's hands trembled, but her resolve hardened. I plan to take back control. You've been playing me, but the game's over. For a moment, they stared at each other, the silence between them crackling with tension. Then John stood, his expression cold. You've already made up your mind. So have I. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Emma alone with the sound of his retreating footsteps. Upstairs, Alex stood in his room, his phone in his hand. He stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over a message from Natalie. Meet me tomorrow. We need to talk. Alone. His heart pounded as he typed a reply. I'll be there. The moment he hit send, dread settled over him. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was clear. The storm Emma feared was already here. The morning dawned colder than usual, the gray sky heavy with unfallen snow. Emma sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. She hadn't slept. The events of the night before played in her mind like a broken record. John's cold departure, Alex's haunted look as he quietly avoided her questions. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Grace. It's happening today. Are you ready? Emma stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the screen. Was she ready? No, but she had no choice. With a deep breath, she replied, yes, let's end this. Alex had left early that morning, his departure marked by nothing more than the soft click of the front door. Emma hadn't stopped him, though her gut screamed at her too. She knew where he was going. Natalie. Grace had been clear. They couldn't allow Natalie's manipulations to continue unchecked. But Emma hadn't expected Alex to walk right into the lion's den. By the time Emma arrived at the cafe where Grace had asked her to meet, her nerves were frayed. Grace was already there, her sharp gaze scanning the room. She gestured for Emma to sit. Alex went to see her, Emma blurted out, her voice trembling. Grace nodded grimly. I know. I followed him. Emma's eyes widened. What? Where is he? What's happening? They're at the park, Grace said calmly. I didn't interfere. Yet. But you should know, Emma, Natalie isn't just playing games with Alex. She's setting him up. Emma's breath hitched. Setting him up for what? Grace leaned in, her voice low. To confront John. She's trying to pit them against each other. I overheard her talking to Alex. She fed him just enough lies to make him believe that John betrayed both of you, and that Alex is the one who needs to handle it. Emma's stomach twisted painfully. She's trying to destroy them both. Grace nodded. And she's dangerously close to succeeding. Emma's mind raced. What do we do? We go to the park, Grace said, her tone firm. You need to confront her. And him. Together. The park was eerily quiet when they arrived, the bare trees swaying gently in the wind. Emma spotted Alex immediately, standing near a bench, his posture rigid. Natalie was with him, her expression a mixture of faux concern and barely concealed triumph. Emma's pulse quickened as she approached, Grace just a step behind her. Alex. Emma called, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Alex turned, his face pale with surprise. Mom? What are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing, Emma said sharply, her gaze flicking to Natalie. But I think I already know. Natalie's confident smirk faltered slightly as Emma stepped closer. You've been playing my son, manipulating him, just like you tried to manipulate my husband. Natalie's eyes narrowed. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie, Grace said, her voice cold and cutting. You've been using Alex to worm your way into John's life. Feeding him lies, pushing him to act. But it ends now. Alex's confusion turned to anger. Wait, what lies? Natalie, what's she talking about? Natalie's facade cracked, her voice rising. Your dad isn't who you think he is, Alex. He's been lying to your mom, lying to all of you. That's enough, Emma interrupted, her voice shaking with fury. You don't care about Alex. You don't care about John. You only care about what you can get out of this. Natalie's expression hardened. I'm not the only liar here. Your husband isn't innocent, Emma. You're fooling yourself if you think he's some kind of victim. Emma stepped closer, her voice low but fierce. Maybe he isn't. But at least I'm facing the truth now. And the truth is, you don't belong in our lives. Stay away from my son. Stay away from my family. Natalie opened her mouth to respond. But Grace stepped forward, her presence commanding. I'd take her advice if I were you. People like you always overplay their hand, Natalie. It's over. Natalie glared at them both, then turned to Alex, her voice softening. Alex, you know me. You know I care about you. Don't let them. Stop, Alex said, his voice trembling. He took a step back, his eyes filled with hurt. Just stop. I trusted you, and you used me. For a moment, Natalie seemed genuinely stunned. But then she straightened, her face a mask of defiance. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her heels crunching against the gravel path. Later that evening, Emma and Alex sat in the living room, the weight of the day heavy between them. I'm sorry, Mom, Alex said quietly, his head in his hands. I should have told you sooner. I didn't know what to do. Emma reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. It's not your fault. None of this is your fault. We were all caught in her web. What about Dad? Alex asked, his voice uncertain. Emma hesitated, then sighed. That's something I still need to figure out. But whatever happens, we'll face it together. As a family. Alex nodded, his eyes red but resolute. Upstairs, Emma stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The cracks in her marriage, her family, her sense of self, they were all exposed now. But in that raw honesty, she felt a strange sense of relief. Her phone buzzed on the counter. It was Grace. "It's done. Take care of yourself, Emma. You deserve better." Emma set the phone down, her reflection staring back at her with weary but determined eyes. The storm had passed. Now, it was time to rebuild.